Hello, this is Jamie Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have Attorney General Pam Bondi. There's free speech, and then there's hate speech, and there is no place, especially now, especially after what happened to Charlie in our society, we will absolutely target you, go after you, if you are targeting anyone with hate speech. And that's posted by Donald Key, and that's a cross post from the LOL subreddit. And that was a clip of Pam Bondi saying that on the Katie Miller podcast, it looks like. And yeah, personally, I think it's interesting how a lot of people on the left that they were saying we need to censor hate speech and misinformation for years. They were completely fine with Tim Walz saying we need to go after hate speech and misinformation, but Pam Bondi says it, and suddenly it's the worst thing ever. That Reddit, just to show you, Redditors have no principles. That they've been pushing to censor what they deem to be hate speech for years, but then Pam Bondi says, and suddenly, there's no such thing as hate speech. And that just goes to show you how, it doesn't really matter what people say, but rather who says it. I remember Tim Walz was on, I think, MSNBC last year, and he said, we need to censor misinformation and hate speech. And Reddit was like, that's completely fine. But, Pam Bondi says it, and everyone loses their minds. And it just goes to show you, they're not principled. I'm sure when the Blue Party comes back into power and starts pushing hate speech again, and they'll forget all about this post, and because their team saying it, and they'll always justify whatever their team does, while always going after whatever the other team does. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Is Being Libertarian, the Libertarian organization that posts to Facebook, Twitter, etc. Actually Libertarian, posted by Wonderful Regret 252. And they added, the posts I've seen lately, and for the longest time actually from this group, have been statist at AF. They pretend to support space for all manner of libertarians, but this is looking less and less true with every post since Charlie Kirk's passing. They actually support cancel culture now. They're supporting the divisiveness between the left and right. They clearly support Trump, a statist. They've lost any credibility they've had. The main libertarian Reddit banned me for this. And yeah, my thoughts on that are, so a lot of politics these days is going to fall into, a lot of people will fall into the leftist or rightist rabbit hole traps, and that's not very much not a libertarian position. Libertarian position is you gotta criticize both of them, and if you want to believe one side's worse than the other, that's fine, but increasingly have a lot of accounts that only go after the right or only go after the left. This post is obviously going after an account for only going after the left, but this subreddit pretty much only goes after the right, and eventually you gotta realize that neither the right or left is that a libertarian currently. If we want to believe one side's worse than the other, that's fine, but increasingly both sides are shown they will justify whatever they feel like, and there's nothing you can do about it. And it's interesting how you had all the No Kings protests earlier this year, but a lot of people at those protests were completely fine with whatever authoritarianism Joe Biden did. It's not that they wanted. It was a good post I saw on Twitter. It's not that they wanted no kings. It's that they wanted different kings, and that's very much what you see in the vast majority of people these days. People just want a dictator they agree with. They don't care anything for liberty. And yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have John Carl. What do you make of Pam Bondi saying she's going to go after hate speech? A lot of your allies say hate speech is free speech. Trump will probably go after people like you because you treat me so unfairly. And that's a post from Ragnar OKXG, and that's crosswords from the Law subreddit. And yeah, personally, I do think, the media does treat Trump unfairly, but that's not an excuse to go after them. I said this before in the past, the libertarian position is just let CNN, MSNBC, the New York Times, Washington Post, all the traditional media sources become irrelevant as social media continues to supplant them. Everyone, I personally do think that they're kind of biased against Trump, and I guess you could argue that could be considered slander or libel, but regardless, ultimately the libertarian position is we need to support all free speech, and that would include slander and libel. If Trump wants to sue them and joke about going after them, that's on him, but, ultimately the libertarian position is, you should just let them die and become irrelevant in peace, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, why does the GOP deny their side as transgender supporters when they have MAGA trans women like Blair White, Caitlyn Jenner, and Sophia Hutchins, posted by Ragnar OKXG, And yeah, it's personally, I would say it's the opposite problem. The GOP always loves to share all their token supporters, like their token black supporters, like Clarence Thomas, or their token, probably a lot of other token blacks in there as well, and a lot of other token racial minorities, and yeah, and same with the Democrats. They always love to share all their token supporters as well. Just because some people believe in something doesn't mean that everyone in the group will believe in it. I know there's an elected Democratic politician in the Pennsylvania State House of Representatives, Jessica Benham, and there's also he's autistic, and there's never elected autistic Republican in the Texas House of Representatives, Briscoe Kane. But just because that they're both autistic doesn't mean that that either party supports the rights of autistic people. I would argue that just because a lot of people have fallen into this pitfall, if you have to go for the lesser of two evils, when in reality, but even though they're both, it's the lesser of two evils is still an evil, and it's important to remember that. And yeah, just because the majority of one group supports something doesn't mean that the whole group will. That's very much how Reddit seems to think, though. Reddit feels very much like that groups like the blacks, the gays, the Jews, etc., should be the Democrats should be entitled to their votes, and that's not true. The Libertarian position is no one's entitled to anything of yours, and that definitely includes your vote. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Fox News host melts down, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's across from the cringe TikTok subreddit. And it looks like Greg Gutfeld melting down on the Fox News panel. Nothing too much to add there. I'm pretty sure if it was an MSNBC host melting down, it would probably already be removed from the subreddit by now. But it's Fox News, and Fox News is outgroup. Fox News is very much corporate media, like MSNBC, CNN, like. It's just kind of like, Con Inc. I think Daily Wire kind of falls into that category as well, that they very much have to fall in these certain parameters of what the RNC says, rather than, a lot of something like X where you can go against the official narrative if you feel like it. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And we have quote-unquote Libertarian Rand Paul says you don't have a right to free speech from NewRepublic.com, posted by Donald Key. And I like this comment from IAO Kim here. If you look at the quote in the article, he's talking about social media and employment contracts. Private companies can determine what content they allow on their platforms, and private companies can contract with employees regarding terms of employment. Nothing quoted in the article mentions government limits on freedom of speech, and nowhere quoted in the article did he say you don't have a right to free speech. And I would agree with that. You do have freedom of speech, but that doesn't mean you have freedom of consequences for your speech. And that's what the left's been pushing for years when it comes to cancel culture. I'm personally not tired of cancel culture, but the left was doing it for years, and it was the greatest thing ever. But the right starts doing it, and they suddenly start losing their minds. It just goes to show you these people have no principles other than my team good, your team bad, as pretty much all these posts indicate. Next, we have Secretary Kennedy, who, if anyone, did Epstein traffic these young women to? Kash Patel himself. There is no credible information done. If there were, I would have brought a case yesterday that he trafficked other individuals. Posted by Gen Z Gingy, and that's crosspost from the LOL subreddit. And yeah, it just goes to show you that the Trump was marketing on campaigning on releasing the Epstein files, and now that he's in power, suddenly they're not releasing the Epstein files. And yeah, it just goes to show you, it's both parties might market themselves as very different, but they're pretty much two sides of the same coin. Reddit seems to care about the Epstein files currently, but I'm sure when there's a Democrat back in power and that Democrat might be implicated in the Epstein files, Reddit will go back to sweeping them under the rug. That's pretty much how it was for Biden's entire term. For Biden's entire term, you couldn't get them to care about the Epstein files for all the tea in China, but now, suddenly they're the most important thing to them, and that just goes to show you, no principles, only teams, and the only reason they care about them is because Orange Man is probably implicated by them. They don't care about them at all for any other reason. I'm pretty sure if Orange Man did ever find a way to get out of being implicated by them, they'd suddenly go back to sweeping them under the rug. Next we have interesting quote posted by Plasman Purdy, And they said, I listen to a lot of tech podcasts since I'm a computer enthusiast and work in IT full time. A lot of these podcasts constantly bring up tariffs and also talk about an attempt by the White House and Congress to censor social media and overturn Section 230. I can't remember which podcast it was, but as the subject came around Trump and his impact on the tech industry, one of the guests said, I think one thing the Trump administration taught me is that it's more important to be libertarian than to be liberal right now. And I agree with that. The only reason why Trump is getting away with a lot of the stuff he's gotten away with is because Congress has, throughout the decades, given the executive branch more and more power, and federal programs have thrown in money at more and more paid people in places. Think about some of the things that have happened. Trump signed an executive order forcing the executive branch to only do business in English. That's effectively made English the official language of the U.S. without needing any legislation from Congress to do so. Congress passed a law that says POTUS can impose tariffs against adversaries in times of war, and POTUS abused the shit out of that law. And I know 2 levels of courts have now said that tariffs are illegal and waiting on SCOTUS to rule, but he wouldn't have even been able to use that loophole he'd be using if the law wasn't put in the first place. Trump couldn't shoot down boats in the Caribbean if we didn't give him the power to deploy troops without asking for a declaration of war from Congress first. And I don't even understand what fucked up logic went into the Federal Reserve Act. Congress has the power of the purse. Why does POTUS appoint the Federal Reserve Chairman or anybody on the board? The power should be reserved for Congress alone. It's bad enough they outsourced the money supply. Did they need to outsource the responsibility of who they picked to control the money supply to POTUS? We'd had a century of power creep, with Congress and SCOTUS granting the executive branch more and more power. Now we have Mr. Reprehensible, and they're using all the power given to him and to make America the worst it can possibly be. And I'd agree with pretty much all that. It just goes to show you how, I think the root of all this problem, you have to go back to Abraham Lincoln. Because historically, Congress was the more powerful branch, but then Lincoln, he kind of started centralizing power in the presidency. I guess he had the excuse of the Civil War, and then Woodrow Wilson also was another one who really centralized power in the presidency, and FDR pretty much is completely unrecoverable after him, I would say. He also was the one who really centralized power in the presidency. And regardless, you have to. I think the libertarian position is, I think if the founders knew how centralized the power in the presidency would be, they wouldn't have created a presidency. They probably would have just kept Congress and the Supreme Court. But ultimately, that we have it set up the way it is set up now. And I think it's very much, you got to end this cult of the presidency. Do whatever the president says. I personally think, if Trump's serious about cutting government, he should think about cutting the entire executive branch. Of course, he'd never do that since it would cost him his own power. But it would very much show me that he'd be principled about cutting government if he was willing to cut an entire branch, especially if it was his own. But I don't think that's possible at this point. I think probably the most libertarian outcome is that we just restart over with a new constitution, or maybe let everyone have their own governments. That's my thoughts there. Then we have DOJ deletes study showing domestic terrorists are most often right-wing from 404media.co, posted by MTRO5585. And yeah, this is why I'm personally against any government databases. All government databases might have, it's subject to whoever the whims of who was ever in power. Personally, if there was a study that, showing most domestic terrorists were left-wing, I'm pretty sure the Biden administration would have removed it. And Reddit wouldn't have cared, but suddenly that the Trump administration does, and it's the worst thing ever. And also to show you how, I'll talk about this from later posts, that all studies are going to be inherently biased, but I'll talk about that on another post coming up. Then we have Trump fires $15 billion defamation lawsuit against New York Times from NPR.org, posted by MTRO5585. And, personally, I talked about this earlier, but I personally I think libertarian position is just let the New York Times become increasingly irrelevant, that seems to be the path it's going. Even the left is turning on them now for not being, for being too pro-Israel. So that just goes to show you how, increasingly the dissident right and the dissident left were both against the mainstream media like the New York Times. I don't think you need a $15 billion defamation lawsuit, but, people will just about to justify, and Trump does love to sue people. So that's my thoughts there. Then we have Trump says he'd consider banning LGBTQ plus pride flags in alarming Oval Office exchange from Advocate.com, posted by CH4Locks. And personally, I don't think any flag should be banned, but ultimately, if the government wants to ban any flags, they have the authority to do so. I'm sure that if the Nazi flag was the one that's getting banned, Reddit would be all over it. But so it's their flag instead, so it's the worst thing ever. And personally, I if you want to fly the Nazi flag, fly the Nazi flag. You want to fly the Soviet flag, fly the Soviet flag. If you want to fly the LGBTQ, whatever letters they added as well, flag, fly that flag. The libertarian position is fly whatever flag you want to, but you don't have to like it. But you're allowed to fly whatever flag you want to on your own property. Next, we have Epstein innocent says Trump hire from Newsweek.com, posted by Helpful Feeding. And that's the article. Cashville says no credible info. Epstein trafficked young woman to others. And yeah, this is what I said earlier. The Trump and his team marketed themselves as they're going to go after the Epstein and find the clients. But suddenly they're in power, and there are no clients anymore. And it just goes to show you how they might say they're principled, but it's all a big club, and you ain't it, as George Carlin famously said. And yeah, that's why I don't think you'll ever get the full Epstein files, because they compromise too many powerful people. And if they do ever come out, I think people will just increasingly see the government as illegitimate, which I think it is at this point. This is all made up of sex traffickers who, as Oliver Anthony famously said in his song Richmond, North of Richmond, I wish they would care for minors rather than just minors on an island somewhere. And yeah, that's my thoughts there. Next, we have a lot of quote-unquote libertarians this week and last week reveal that they are anti-leftist or Republican. If you are going to post polls that show leftists prefer political violence more, but show ignore state-sanctioned political violence both Repugs and the Dems promote, you are a partisan hack. And it looks like a link, picture of a tweet from Robert Sterling. Very liberal people are 8 times more likely to say political violence is justified than very conservative people, 25% versus 3%. This isn't a both sides problem. We are never going to solve it pretending otherwise. And they added, the OP added stupid poll. And yeah, personally, it's a lot like that ADL chart they're pushing that says, all the right-wing people commit all the political violence, and this chart says, all the left-wing people commit political violence. Ultimately, all charts and studies are going to be subject to the bias of who's ever making them, and that's why you should look at all of them skeptically, I would say. And yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. Everyone's got an agenda they want to show you, and it's very important to remember that when it comes to social media. Then next post is percent. Trump's push to scrap quarterly company reports will be a win for investors from CNBC.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and they added, that's one way to try and hide a recession and economic damage unleashed by the administration. And yeah, personally, I think, if companies do want to publish quarterly reports, they should be able to, but I don't think the government should be encouraging them to do so one way or the other. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have who is most likely to fall for fake news from news.ubc.ca, posted by MTRO5585, and that looks like a study from the University of British Columbia, and it says most likely targets of fake news are Gen Z, born 1997-2012, non-male, less educated, more conservative. And yeah, personally, I do think I guess that you can make the case ultimately, and I think the libertarian positions, if you want to market any group as being susceptible to fake news, that's fine. But, ultimately everyone is susceptible to fake news. Like, look at Reddit. Reddit's pretty much the fake news website propaganda machine. I like how Reddit Lies the Twitter account Reddit Lies calls it an information desert, and that's very much true. It's very much a propaganda machine for fake news, but Redditors don't think it's fake news. They think it's all real news, even though they think, the conservatives are stupid for all the fake news they fall for. But, ultimately, everyone's subject to propaganda and misinformation, despite how a lot of people might market themselves, and it's important to always be skeptical of everything you read. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have head of the U.S. Department of Justice, Attorney General Pam Bondi, threatens private businesses with criminal prosecution if they refuse to print Charlie Kirk posters saying businesses cannot discriminate. But that's posted by Donkey, and that's across from the Mayor McCheese subreddit. And yeah, personally, my thoughts on that are, I do think businesses, if they don't want to print something, they should be forced to print something. It's like very much like the Masterpiece Cake Shop refusing to bake a cake for the gay couple. If they don't want to serve someone because of their for any reason whatsoever, I think the libertarian position is, they should be able to. It's even if it's something that's frankly a bad reason. I think Lester Mack should have served black people if he wanted to back when he was running his chicken shop in Georgia back in 1964, but he didn't want to serve black people, and I think the libertarian position is there. He shouldn't have been forced to do so if he doesn't want to, and that's very much the libertarian position. With that being said, corporations can be authoritarian, but if you don't like that an authoritarian decision that a corporation makes, you're free to go somewhere else. And that's something I see with Reddit. I personally don't like a lot of decisions Reddit makes, but I'm free to go to other platforms like X or Facebook or et cetera, et cetera. But with that being said, it's still important to call them out for their authoritarian actions, I would say. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have teachers getting fired over Charlie Kirk death praise, posted by Track Black Nate. And they said, so this has happened in district I work in and other districts. Teachers are government employees. The government shouldn't be able to fire anyone for freedom of speech. I don't think it's necessarily moral to mock or praise someone getting assassinated, but people can say whatever they want. Teachers are taxpayer paid. This is a huge problem, and no one seems to brawl out this issue up. Thoughts. And yeah, I guess I could kind of see both sides here, I personally would argue that since teachers are taxpayer paid, they should be subject to more scrutiny rather than less when it comes to their posts on social media, because a lot of people's money is going to them whether they like it or not. It's not like a private business where it's not being funded by taxpayer dollars. So yeah, my thoughts there are if teachers want to say whatever they want to, that's fine. But if they're going to face consequences for their speech, that's important for them to know as well. You need to remember that just because you are in a position of state power doesn't mean you're suddenly infallible. And you definitely see that a lot of teachers. Ultimately, I think the libertarian position is you got to get rid of government-run schools first and foremost, because they're going to be inherently biased to the state. But I think, as long as we have them, the teachers should be held to more scrutiny rather than less when it comes to their social media posts. Especially if, it depends. If they're posting online on their side, I guess that would be more okay. But if they're posting directly under their name and face, I personally would say, I would hold them to as much scrutiny as possible. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys on the next episode. Bye.